Hello and welcome to another episode of the Disruptive Dialogue. My name is Thomas Cotton and I'm your host. I'm also the founder and CEO of Redemption and Advancement Alliance, where our mission is to disrupt the cycles of incarceration. Today we have on our show Sabrina Brown Gray, and she's the author of a book called Mending, Brokenness, a spiritual journey to authentic wholeness. Sabrina is a retired teacher who taught for 33 years and continues to teach adults at Roxbury and Masbury Community Colleges as an adjunct professor. Sabrina accepted the call also to preach in 2005 and was ordained an elder in the AME Church in 2008. She has traveled the world internationally and done missionary and educational work in Senegal and Tanzania. And she hopes to return to Africa one day with her passion for teaching and preaching. She is currently the founder of Using Hands and Heart Business and Ministry, focusing on using her gifts of teaching, disciple building, and mercy. Welcome to the show, Sabrina, and we're glad to have you today.
Thank you, Thomas. It's a blessing to be here. I'm excited. I'm excited. Number one, just to be on this podcast, but number two, just to be able to talk about the book. And you and I have had many conversations about it.
Yes.
But this is a broader audience and a wider view to really sort of talk about something that has been real to me.
Mm-hmm.
Just brokenness. I guess I have to start back, and I don't know how long the podcast is, but I have to start back. When I accepted Christ when I was 8 years old at a Billy Graham crusade in Kansas City, where I'm from, Kansas City, Kansas. And so God's been working in my life for a long time. I didn't always know He was, but He was. And one way that He has shown me over the recent years is with the writing. As Thomas sort of told you, I've been teaching, and my teaching is more than just a vocational career. My teaching is a call. I'm called to teach, and I teach and called to preach as well. But God has just really spoken to me in recent years about writing. And if I had time, I'd go back and tell you, when I was a little kid, and I was sitting at my mother and sitting down by my mother's knee, and I was writing and I was illustrating. I was doing that. When I was 6 years old, I remember that. And I handed it to my mother, and I don't know, it was scribbled and it was little words here and there. But I told Mommy one day, I said, Ma, one day I'm going to be an author. And of course, my mother said, of course you will, Sabrina. I know you are. And lo and behold, here I am. Yes, I did just have my first book published through Zulon Press. And the title of it is Mending, Brokenness. And I'm going to say a little bit about it. And then, Thomas and I are going to get into some conversation. But again, having walked with the Lord for several years now, there was times that I was broken. And talk about a little bit in the book. Certainly didn't talk about all the times, but I did talk about brokenness. And God really pressed on me, that I needed to share that people needed to know that brokenness is okay as long as we don't stay there. As long as we know who is our mender in the middle of the brokenness, or in the beginning or at the end, as long as we know that God is our mender. And God really pressed on me to really sort of share. Part of my ministry is being transparent, sharing some of the good, the bad, and the ugly. A lot of
Right.
times as Christians, we don't want to talk about the ugly, but I really take the risk of talking a little bit about the ugly in my book, talking about mending brokenness. So,
Yeah. So when we think about mending brokenness and the brokenness that we all feel, it's a blessing to be able to see your transparency in writing about brokenness and just being here today. So I'm grateful to have you on the show. We have a deeper connection we'll talk about later in the show. But for right now, your inspiration, you're an inspiring person to be able to just share the clarity within your brokenness and this spiritual journey to authentic wholeness, not just being whole or faking it or looking good and acting good, but the wholeness that it takes to really mend brokenness. So why did you decide to just be as transparent as you are and write about brokenness?
well, again, growing up and just my Christian walk, a lot of times you read Christian books, and a lot of times people tell you, you know, where they are now, how they, but they don't necessarily talk about the steps that they sort of went through, the ups and the downs, the 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. And again, in my relationship with God, and that's what I talk about in the book also, I became secure enough with him, and I talk about that in my introduction, that I no longer feel shame about the mistakes or the uglies that I've had in my life. And because I no longer feel that shame, because which a lot of times the shame and the guilt really don't allow us to be open with one another. Whereas I think as a senior, that I have the responsibility with sharing, being transparent, letting people know that Christ is the one that you can share all your uglies with and all your brokenness with. He's not going to turn around and tell somebody. He's not going to throw it back in your face. And yet and still, he lovingly receives you, helps you. He gets down in the uglies with you and helps you to walk and mend through them. So I just felt that God was saying for me to share, not all, but I certainly do share some of my broken areas, really encouraging people to be vulnerable with God, to be willing to share with others as well.
So one of the areas you shared right off the top was about divorce, and really getting into that book. It's just like it starts off really immediately. Like, here's some transparency of where
right.
this brokenness showed up in my life. Talk a little bit about that brokenness, of how it showed up in your life and you and the other person through this
Ooh,
process.
that's again, we just don't talk about. We don't
Yeah.
talk about it, and it's almost like it's forbidden territory. And I don't mind entering into that forbidden territory. Yeah, I got divorced, and that was the last thing that I thought would happen to me. I just knew I was, in fact, I was determined to be married because my parents had been divorced. I said, I know I'm gonna stay married, and sure enough, that dream got broken,
Yeah.
and it came out of nowhere. I had no idea it was coming, and I was truly broken. And and I talk about this in the book. And brokenness really means that you just don't have that bounce back anymore. It's just like you're lost. You feel like it's the end of the road. You said you're holding on by all tens. Well, I had just lost my 9th finger, so that my 10th one was there, and I couldn't even hold on with that. I didn't know. I was angry. I was sad. I was frustrated. I was all that. I was all that. And I had 5 kids, and trying to, work through that and trying to parent them and help them work through it. I end up moving back to Kansas. And I always say as a joke, Dorothy moved, moved back home to lick her wounds. Dorothy went back home to lick her wounds. And that's exactly what it was. And I was angry. I was angry what happened. I was angry that God let it happen. But yet and still, as I tell the Lord the joke all the time, always when I get mad at God, a lot of people say, you can't get mad at God. Well, I do. I get frustrated and I tell him when I am. And I say, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. And then when I turn around, there I am talking to him again. There's not a time that I can't talk to God. But that's just how wonderful he is. He knew. First of all, he knew this was going to happen. Second of all, he knew what I was feeling. And part of my mending with my divorce, excuse me, God did not tell me to deny whatever I was feeling. He said, when you're feeling hurt, feel it. When you're feeling angry, feel it. I was mad. I was cussing. I was fussing. I was all that. And God said, dance with it. I said, you say what? I dance when I'm happy. I dance when there's good music. He said, dance with your emotions.
Right.
Dance with every one of them. He said, don't deny them. But so many times you got to, pull yourself up by your bootstrings. Come on, hold it together. And that's what I was initially telling myself. Girl, hold it together. You can. But I just couldn't. I couldn't. And God said, you don't have to. I want you to dance. And God danced with me through my anger. He danced with me through my pain. He danced with me through my rejection. He danced with me. And he is the best dance partner there is. He never told me to feel ashamed of how I was feeling, but to dance with him and give it to him. And that's what I can testify, how God mended me. He mended me by allowing me to be right where I was. He didn't require and say, oh, well, you got to do this. You should have done that. You could have done that. He said, my child, be with me where you are. And when I was in those places, God began to heal me such that when that pain came, it began to not hurt as much. Not to say all the pain went away. When I felt rejected, God said, give it to me. And again, because of my relationship with him, I really was able. And there were times when I said, forget it, I ain't doing this. There were times when I said, this isn't working. But again, I stayed with God and he mended me and continues. And that's just this. The mending process is a continuing one, but it is a sustainable and it is a steadfast one.
That's good. That's so good. And the name of your first chapter is Dancing with Brokenness.
Dancing with
Like,
brokenness.
and you start thinking about how you dance through brokenness. Like people, like, I don't want to dance in my brokenness. Are you crazy?
Yeah.
But sometimes to overcome some of the worst things, we have to do things that really don't make sense.
Yeah.
And in that, and I want to just in that chapter, I want to share one of the things that really jumped out at me first. When I was first started reading it, it says, "When we are broken, we hurt emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. Our hearts are wounded. We self-medicate to deal with the pain using medicines like emotional eating, drugs, sex, spending money, or drinking. We do all this trying to fix the brokenness that only one can
That's
fix.
right. That's
Only
right.
one can mend our brokenness, and that is Jesus.
Exactly.
The many things that feel good to us can break us even more if you think about it. Like we have all this brokenness, but the things that you said, like emotional eating, drugs, sex, spending, those things are the ingredients to more brokenness,
Yeah.
to more hurt.
Yeah.
And we tend to run to that, but run away from the things that can help us heal. Like for you, you did the total opposite. I'm gonna dance in my brokenness. I'm
Yeah.
gonna embrace this. So tell us about that embrace of brokenness and how that leads to you having victory in your vulnerability.
Well, again, it's not something that you would initially think, that you'd want to do. But one reason why I was able to embrace that is because of my relationship with the Lord. He really, it wasn't just about the brokenness of the divorce. God really he had to mend me in some other areas. And the relationship that I have with him, I try to be as honest as I can with God. And the reason why I am honest with him is because, again, I know he ain't going to go and tell nobody. I know he's not going to throw it back in my face.
Right.
But again, there's a difference between conviction. When God convicts you, Satan sends guilt and shame, but God sends conviction. And that's what he did. He said, Sabrina, these are some areas that you need to work on. These are some areas you need to work on. I talk about there's a sermon that I preach when I go and I promote my book, and it's called "Let's Get Naked," and it's living a good story. And a lot of people say, "Let's get naked," And with that, I talk about a sermon series that's called Christ the one who lives in your home, something of that, something along that lines. And it's a cassette tape. Tell you how old it is, but it talks about how you walk with Christ through every room of your house. You take him in the living room and say, "Oh God, this is what we do here in the living room." And you take him into the kitchen. This is where we cook the meals. And you take him into the bedroom, into the basement, into the dining room, into the attic. And then at the end, the last one, you sit down and you say, "Well, Christ, praise God. You went through my home. What do you have to say?" And Christ says, "Oh, thank you for allowing me to go through your home. You have a wonderful home, a beautiful home. But there's one room you haven't let me in." And you sit there and say, "What? What? I took you through every room in the house." He said, "No, there's that room in the back."
Today's episode is brought to you by Redemption and Advancement Alliance, whose mission is to provide innovative support to people to disrupt the cycles of incarceration and poverty. Go to www.redeem-advance.org to find out more information or make your $1,000, $100, $10, or even $1 donation to help support people who want to stay alive and free.
Yeah, and this series talks about how you walk God through walk God through all the rooms in your house, the living room, what you do there, and in the kitchen, what meals you cook, and in the bedroom and in the bathroom. You go through every house, every room in your house, even the attic and the basement. And then you sit down at the very end and say, God, praise God, I thank you for how you blessed our house. And Christ turns and he says, thank you so much for allowing me to, walk through your house and be a part of your house. But there's still one room you haven't let me in. And you sit there, bewildered and say, what, you try to go through it, say, what room, God? What room? What room? And, the Lord tells you that room in the back of your house around the corner with the 2 deadbolt locks on it. And you say, and you sit there shocked. And what God is talking about is that closet. And I believe everybody has a closet that they don't let God in. And it's the closet of all the good, the uglies, the hatreds, the jealousies, the all those things you say one day you're going to deal with, the unresolved things. And Christ said, I need to get into that room. And I don't know about you, but for me, there were some real things that I did not, that I was ashamed of, that I was embarrassed about, or that I regretted, a lot of regrets. And that's how good God is. He says, let me in there so I can clean the closet, so I can mend all those brokenness too. And sure enough, and that means you have to become vulnerable. And being vulnerable is difficult. Because usually when you're vulnerable, you're setting yourself up. That means you are, you're putting everything out on the table, which means that if you're not careful, somebody can hurt you because of your vulnerability. That you do not have to worry about with God. He'll never do that. But he wants us to be honest with him. And I talk about that in the book. We have to be honest with him and tell him all those things that are in the closet, those jealousies that we have, the hatred that we may have.
Yeah.
And that is where when you can be honest with God that way, there's no limit to what God can do. And it's a process. I talk about in the book too. Sometimes it's immediate deliverance. And then sometimes it's a process. It's a process. But we need to step aside from in front of that closet door, let God in, and let him do the mending. Let him clean that closet out. And I guarantee you will become whole when he does that.
Love it. I love it. It's interesting when you talk about vulnerability and, the things that God says he'll do for you. It reminds me of just taste and see, and you'll find that the Lord is good, right? A lot of times we don't want to taste and see because the vulnerability that comes along, the shame, the everything else, but you address that shame when you're talking about, getting vulnerable, letting into that one closet that has a double bolt locks on it. And we all have that closet. Anybody who doesn't have that
Yep.
closet is not really being honest with themselves, right? And they're just keeping it locked up. I can ignore it, but you can't continue to ignore it if you're going to heal from mend this brokenness. You got to be straightforward with it. So you go down a little bit more in your book and you talk about storms versus suffering, which is like, wait a minute, you mean there's going to be storms, but it looks a little different. Tell us about storms versus suffering.
Yeah. Oh wow, that was a challenging chapter because I'm still working through that. I'm still understanding what storms are and suffering. And there's scriptures that I refer to. Talks about in Philippians, I believe it's in the 3rd chapter, says, I want to suffer with you. I want to get to know Christ, to the point that I'm able to suffer with him. And then there's one in 1 Peter, I think it's 5 and 10, that talks about after we've suffered for a while. And that really was the scripture that I held on to in the middle of my brokenness. After I've suffered for a while, he's promised that he would come and he would mend us, that he would strengthen us, that he would give us, that he would support us. And that was what I held on to. So we talk about the suffering of Job, and we talk about the the all the different things that we go through, the sufferings and all. And I'm losing my train of thought, so I'm gonna have to stop there for a
Yeah.
minute.
It's just the storms
Suffering.
versus suffering, right?
Yes,
And
yes,
so when you're going through
yes,
the
yes, yes,
storms and
yes.
understanding that there will be storms, right? And
There will be. There
and
will
that's
be.
the things, the suffering that's not going to last forever. And when I started thinking about
Yes.
that, and when I was reading through that part, storms versus suffering, it's such an amazing part of the book because, you know, we often hear the scripture quoted, "No weapon formed against us shall prosper." We forget that the weapon will be formed though against us. It's just there's no
That's right.
prospering
It
in it.
will.
And so when I started thinking about storms versus suffering, that was the big deal to me. It was like, there are these storms, there is this suffering, but we can make through. Before we go further into the book, I'll be remiss if I don't back up and go to history because the history of brokenness didn't start in your marriage. And
Ah,
and when you go
no.
back to the history of brokenness, what are some of the things that stand out to you in the brokenness of your life that led you to like being a certain type of way and recognizing that, what, I can't be this way forever. I need to make some changes. So go back to the history.
Ooh. And that's again what my book really talks about, and that means again being in a position, being vulnerable, being open enough that God can sort of walk through you, walk with you through some through other times. And I talk about the brokenness I had with my brother, and and the difficulties I had in that relationship when I was growing up. And I remember I didn't like my brother. I really didn't. I didn't like him. And God told me that I need to deal with that. I need to go and talk to him and tell him about the hurts that I had in our childhood and everything. So God truly had a sense of humor. Here I was, hurting. He said, go talk to him. And sure enough, we sat down and we talked and we prayed and we cried and we forgave and everything. And I came back home and I said, okay, God, I forgive my brother. Praise the Lord. But then the next time I saw him, he said something that sent me right back to that same place. I said, God, what happened? I forgave him. And God told me, and that's the chapter in my book that's called Forgiveness is Like an Onion. He said, I had forgiven him. But the manifestations, a lot of times, of our forgiveness, it takes time. It takes time. When you've been hurt over a period of time, it doesn't just disappear. You have to, again, allow God to work it through and in your with your forgiveness and with your mending. Also, I remember with my father. I remember when I've dealt with him with my father's passed on, but I remember just the difficulty I had when him and my mother got divorced. I tell people this all the time. I can remember times. I can remember when the night my father left, and I call that he abandoned me. I can paint a picture of it. Him and Mama were standing there, and he had his hat on, he had his overcoat on, and he had a suitcase there on the floor. And I ran and I said, "Oh, Daddy, where we going? Where we going?" Oh, because my father worked for the railroad, so I just knew for sure we must be going to some kind of trip if he had a suitcase. But him and Mama weren't laughing; they weren't smiling. And he told me at that point, he said, "No, sweetie, we're not going on vacation." I said, "Well, you got your suitcase," and then he told me, "I'll be back to visit you." Now, as an 8-year-old child, I didn't understand be back to visit. You live here. What are you talking about? Be back to visit. But I remember that, and I remember that was one of my first real broken times that I really remember. And I talk about how we need to sometimes travel back in our past to allow God to really do some deep healing. And we have to deroot it. Again, I talk about in
Yep.
my book how my father had a gardening tool, and he was outside, working with the dandelions. And I ran. I said, "Daddy, what are you doing? What are you doing?" He said, "I'm digging up dandelions and the little yellow flowers." I said, "You ain't got to do that. Just you yank the yellow flower off. Here they are." And my father said, "Oh no, dear. There are roots that are much deeper than that little yellow flower on top." And that's the way it is, that we have to allow God to deroot, to go back. Otherwise, it's just like snatching off the top of the dandelion. If we don't allow God to really deroot and to go back to where it first began, and that's why I went back to when my parents got divorced, that brokenness of abandonment. That's why I went back to the brokenness with my brother. That's why. Because I want God to get it I don't want to just yank off the yellow flower, because otherwise it becomes you're just doing the same thing over and over. But when God delivers you from the root, when he deroots it from there, you can walk in your deliverance. You can walk in your freedom. And that's a part of your mending, your brokenness mending too.
You know, there's one big thing that you talked about, and I just want you to share how that played out in your life: forgiveness. You know, I talk about forgiveness often being like poison. You know, you drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. It's not going to happen. And then I also talk about how forgiveness anchors you to a moment in time where, until you learn how to forgive that moment in time, you never move really forward from there.
Yeah.
So how important was forgiveness to you in mending your brokenness?
Well, again, because my relationship with Christ is most important. And I knew I had to deal with that. I knew I had to deal with that. Certainly, the Lord and I, we was going along fine. But when it's something just not quite right, and again, God didn't badger me over. You got to do. He didn't badger me with it, but he just gently said, "Sabrina, you need to deal with that." And he said, "We need to deal with that." So he said, "Go out there and deal with it. When you finish, let me know, and we'll see if we can get back together." No, he walked me through it. And I mean, it wasn't something that just happened automatically. God worked with me. And I really, I wanted to deny it. I wanted to reason it away. I didn't want to do it. So I was honest. I said, "God, I don't want to do it. I ain't doing it." God said, "Okay." And he just gently said, "Sabrina." And he just showed me so many ways and so many reasons why I need to do it. Because forgiveness, it ain't about the other person. It was about my relationship with God. And as I sought to grow deeper, I had to deal with that. As I sought to grow deeper in my relationship, I had to deal with that. It's not about the other person. It's not letting them off the hook. It's not saying, "Oh, what they did wasn't important." It's about my full, complete, total, mended relationship with God. I had to do it. I got to the point that I wanted to do it because I knew I needed that in order for my relationship to thrive and to flourish and to grow. So that's what mendingness really is I mean, that's what forgiveness is really about. It's about your relationship with Christ. And again, he doesn't belittle, or he doesn't forget about how you feel. That some things have hurt us badly. Some things have really not done us very well. So God is never telling us that that's not important. But what he's saying, again, when we choose to forgive, let God, what they say, vengeance is mine, said God. He'll do it much better. So if we, again, and I don't want to sound facetious, and some things are hard to forgive. Listen, when you're abused, it's hard to forgive. So I'm not saying that it's going to happen just like that, but it's again, if you see it from the standpoint, what do I have to do for my relationship here? God to take care of it here.
And then the freedom that you feel as you start mending, as you start feeling that
Yes.
brokenness and those weights come off of you, it gives you that momentum to continue that forgiveness, to continue in that. And that's really the blessed part of forgiving and allowing. It doesn't mean that what someone else did was right, like you said. What they did was what they did, but the healing is all yours and everything else. So you have this part in the book called Connecting the Dots. And so talk a little bit about connecting the dots, and then we'll start going into some of the things that you're giving to people to help them overcome their brokenness. But what are connecting the dots?
Connecting the dots. And I talk about, as a kid, I used to, the little books you
Mm-hmm.
had, and you had to start with number one, you connect number one dot with number two, and you end up with a picture at the end. Well, a lot of times that's what the life dots are. And until you connect them, all they are just a lot of dots on a paper, a lot of dots with numbers. But again, God is the connector of all those dots. And sometimes when it just ain't making sense, when it just doesn't seem like, well, God, what is this picture? What is this? What is this? God will, again, if we trust him, he will help connect the dots. He will help you see that, again, nothing is wasted with God. Nothing is wasted with him. And every time, his word goes out, it accomplishes just what he pleases it to do. So we have to understand, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts, his ways. So even when we don't understand or the picture, or it doesn't look like it's just a bunch of dots, God has a way of connecting them all and bringing it out for our good. All things work, and he will bring it out for our good. I promise you, he will. The picture may not look like anything, but just a bunch of little dots. And even when you begin to connect some, it's like, God, this is not turning out to be anything. Again, we've trusted him with our lives, so we have to depend that he has a plan, a picture for each of our lives.
And that's important to know how to connect the dots too, because if you don't start connecting the dots, then when we get to, I don't know which exact chapter it is, but it's meditative mending questions. You can't really even participate in those questions if you don't have some of the dots there. What is your truth? When you start asking, what is your truth? If there's no dots there, then whatever truth you've actually formulated in your head, whatever narrative you have in your head, that becomes your truth. But what is the truth? Because there's a truth we believe and there's the actual truth that happened. Are you broken now? A lot of times we've come so far away from where we used to be, we feel like we're not broken anymore, but there's still a lot of brokenness and healing that needs to take place on a regular basis. And so, being able to answer those meditative mending questions are very important. What was your reasoning for putting those meditative mending questions into your book?
Well, I think again, and I left places in the book, and I didn't really sort of understand. Again, one of them dots, didn't quite understand why I did, but I actually left places for people to write notes, and I'm just really praying that, as people read the book, that they will begin to write some notes to themselves, that they can really go back and really think about some of these things, and then so by the time you get back to the meditative thoughts, it's like, again, there's some dots right there, and okay, God, what are you saying? And sometimes you have to, step back to begin to see the dots, or you have to, ask God, what dot is here? Or sometimes we don't want to admit that a dot is there. So I think that, the meditative thought just helps us to begin to ask God, where am I? I think, where am I? Where am I in my dot picture? Or, what connection? Because God, I don't see any connection, or I may not even want a connection. I don't want that to be connected to me. I don't want that. So again, the vulnerability, the honesty, and then once we're at that point, again, God will begin to show you how things are connected, and how he's making a tapestry, a beautiful picture with you, with your dots in your life.
Yeah. And those dots are so important to fill in, because as we start to ask the questions, we start to get answers. The one thing that I learned in my life is, I learned that asking the right questions gives you the right answers. When we're just asking God, why did I go through this? That's probably not the right question, because we get to vent. We're not listening for answers. We're actually just venting. But if we start thinking about stuff, why did I go through this particular thing? And how can this benefit me? How can this help me grow? What do I need to do in this situation? I found that asking the right questions gives us the right answers, because then we start to really challenge ourselves versus challenge everybody else. And so the important thing of asking questions, I thought that was so clever to put that right in the book, and to make sure that you give people an opportunity to ask these questions, to really recognize their brokenness and to recognize that, look, I'm still broken and it's okay. And that's
Yeah.
okay. So when you think about still being broken, because this is a journey, this is not a destination of healing is a journey, not a destination. As you're going through your healing and you still recognize the brokenness in your life, what would you share with other people who are, they're older in years, they may be 30, 40, 50 years old and they're still dealing with the same brokenness that they had in childhood? What would you share to encourage them to get to that mending part of brokenness?
I want to say don't be discouraged and don't give up, and that's I mean that's easy to say when you're not in the middle of it. My whole thing is again, I don't mean to sound facetious at all, but we got to trust God. And I lost my train of thought again.
And it's basically, what would you say to people to help them get through their brokenness into a point of healing?
Okay. And number one, I think just like what you said, it is a process. You have to trust the process. You have to trust the process. The 3 steps forward and the 2 steps back. And you are in it for good with God. If you're in it for good with God, you will have some steps forward and some steps back. I can't emphasize enough just making sure this happens with your relationship with God, because once this relationship happens with God and once this is strong and you're constantly working on this, everything else, just like it says in Matthew 6, if we trust God, that and if we put him first, he's going to make sure everything else is taken care of. And you're right, it's again, everybody's steps may not necessarily be the same, and I don't know if anyone's going to go through the same thing that I did, and that's not important. What is important is, again, trusting God that he's got a plan. He has a plan, and he's willing to walk with you through it and to get you to that
Absolutely.
plan. If we say we love the Lord, if we say that, then we've got to walk it. We've got to walk it. We've got to talk it. We have got to be vulnerable. We've got to be honest. We've got to allow him to walk through our hurts with us, walk through that brokenness with us. And again, we get stronger. That's almost the oxymoron of it. You get stronger. You get stronger in the weak times. You get stronger as you yield. You get stronger, as some people say. When you become vulnerable, when you become honest, a lot of people see that as weakness. And how can you become stronger in that? And that's because God is the one that replaces all that hurt and all those things with his strength. We can't do it by ourselves. We can't.
It's interesting. There's a couple thoughts that came to my head when you're talking. You referenced the verse in Matthew, and Matthew 6:33 is the one I think you're referring to, which is my
Mm-hmm.
favorite verse in the Bible. It's the one that leads and guides my life because there's a promise attached to it. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. So it's kind of like, God, if I do what you ask me to do, which is seek you first, then you're saying all these
Yeah.
things will be added unto me. Well, God, if I seek you first and all these things aren't added unto me, you're a liar. That's what I used to think when I was first a believer. It's like, you're a liar. And,
Understand?
but
Understand?
so I do it, and I did it then, I do it now. And it's almost as if God is saying, that's easy work for me. That's easy work. But you gotta put in the work to really seek me first. And then the other thing is, when you say we get stronger through these things, and that you gotta allow God to walk with you through these things. And it reminds me of the uh, footprints in the sand poem, where during life we're walking and then God's there's 2 sets of footprints, and then we start going through hard times, there's only one set of footprints, and we go, God, why did you leave me in this situation? And he's like, I didn't leave you. It's those times that I carried you. That's why you see one.
Yeah, Carrie. Yeah,
And
yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
allowing God to be God in your life is very important. And being able to mend your brokenness, the spiritual journey through authentic wholeness. Now, there's so many different things. It's an easy read. The book is not that long. It's a very easy read, but it's powerful. It's packed full of different ways of looking at our brokenness from a different perspective and becoming better within that. So before we head out today, I just want you to share your last thoughts about, this book, what it means to you and why you want people to have it in their hands.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was thinking while you were talking too that a lot of times in our Christian walk, a lot of times when people accept Christ, you say, "Come accept Christ." And God will be, will help you and will love you, but we also have to understand that there is suffering. There is suffering in the Christian walk, and a lot of times we don't want to talk about that, and we don't want to talk about the suffering. But again, that scripture in Philippians 3:10 that says, that we want to know. I remember Paul was talking about how he was from the right family, he had the right education, he had degrees, he had everything, but he said that is nothing. That is nothing compared to the knowledge of knowing God, and that needs to really sort of be our aim, that we would know God, and knowing Him, we have to also know suffering. Now, we don't have to be masochists. We don't say, "Oh yeah, God, send me all the suffering." No, but we have to understand. We have to understand that even because He said, if we suffer with Him, we will reign with Him. That suffering is part of our Christian walk. And we might as well, if that's a part of it, we might say, "God, come on, let's do it. Walk with me." And I think if anything, with my book, again, I'll go back to the sermon that I preached. Let's get naked before God, get naked before Him, and live a good story. Live a good story. I believe every one of us has a story, and I believe Christ wants us to share our story. You may write a book, you may not, I don't know. But the point of it is, we all have stories. We all have stories about how Christ has worked in our life. We need to be willing to share that. Tell it to a young person. Tell it to a friend. Tell it. And I think that's what I really want people to really get from this book, is that you have a story. And as the saying goes, your story is your greatest asset, not your 401k, not your 401b. Your story is your greatest asset because it's yours. It's not mine. It's your story. It's your story of how God has worked, has mended, has helped you through broken times. So I think that's the real thing that I really want people to get, that they have a story, that they will share it. They will share it, and that they will share it freely and openly.
Well, your book and this podcast is the lead into our next series, which is Mending Brokenness, off the topic of your book and the title of your book. And we will bring in a lot of people who have those stories. One of the people we're going to talk to spent 32 years in prison. The next person, 26 years in prison. And, just people who have gone through these stories, but how they mended their brokenness and the way they're still mending their brokenness. And the lead in from this book is such a great way of being able to introduce their stories and really talk about it, because not only are we going to talk about personal brokenness, we're going to talk about community brokenness. We're going to talk about family brokenness and different ways that we can begin to understand how to heal some of these, bigger issues that we get to see in our society. But, it starts with us personally, working through our own brokenness. And so I want everybody to be able to get your book. Where can they find your book at?
Mending Brokenness can be found either at Amazon.com, BarnesandNobles.com, or Zulon Press.
So I have mine here, and it's on Kindle version. So go get the Kindle version. I got it immediately. We were talking. You said it. I was like, I'm going to get the book, download it immediately, and I'm in it. And so you can get on the Kindle version. You said there's also an audio version?
The audio. If you go to BarnesandNobles.com or Amazon.com, they have the audio where someone's actually reading. Someone's reading my book. Awesome. So yeah. So it's just again, read it and write, just like Habakkuk, just like God told Habakkuk. Write it down. Write it down.
So how can they get in touch with you or find you? What, you have a website? social media?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. And I'm stopping right there because my website is not currently
Okay,
up right
so we'll
now.
stop right here.
I will. It will be up. I do have. I don't know if I can give my email. I do have my email
You give me
address.
email.
So that or either.
You
I'm sorry.
yeah.
Okay.
So
All
let's
right.
go ahead and do it right here.
Uh,
Go ahead and say how they get in
okay.
touch with you, and then we'll start there. So ready? Here we go. How can people get in touch with you?
People can get in touch with me. I'm currently putting my website together, and I'm sure I will let Thomas know when that is currently that will be up. But in the meantime, it's sbwgrace77@gmail.com. And I welcome comments, questions, ideas. So S as in Sam, B as in boy, W as in water, the word grace 77 at
Oh, that's
gmail.com.
amazing. So now
Amen.
I did talk a little bit earlier about we have a different connection. Sabrina is actually my cousin. And Sabrina and I have been cousins forever, but we finally met for the first time last year in July. First time we ever met.
Yeah.
We did our family tree and we found through our family tree the different family members and everything else. And we had a family reunion in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that was our first time we met in person. We actually started doing calls and everything else a few years ago, and it's been amazing to really grow together and
I
really
know.
spend the
I
time
know.
together and just the blessing that it is to find family that you never knew was there. And even mending
Yeah.
in that brokenness where there's this disruption
Amen.
in
Amen. Definitely.
family structures,
Definitely.
but now we're looking to we're put together our family and the family trees and the histories and continue to pass it on so that we don't have that disruption in life and family. So it's been a blessing
Amen.
and love
Amen.
you. And I appreciate you so much.
Thank you. Excited. God bless you. Love you too. And Thomas, may God bless you and pour into you and build you up on all sides. You may continue to do his work. Amen.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate everybody else sitting in on this episode of Disruptive Dialogue. Hey, we have about 7 more in this series that you're going to come, Mending Brokenness, 7 more shows. So we hope that you'll join us for this series that are coming up. Like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, and always leave your comments. We love to hear your comments and how you feel about
Amen.
the
Amen.
show